are you?
Between the work and the kids, Jonas, you bought any new pieces?
Yeah. facts will be demolished.
I never heard such stupid things.
You don't know which of your arguments will be totally destroyed.
He's never said precipitous withdrawal.
He said immediately.
Is it possible to actually complete a sentence?
And then you got to come back, and you're now rattled, you're shaken up.
You asked me to engage with their serious arguments. I've yet to hear a serious argument from either of these two. I am a practical man.
Sit back and listen to this. No, I think you've had your say.
And you don't know what the hell to say, but you got to say something.
I'm not prepared to sacrifice the African continent for some free market neoliberal ideology.
Let's save the bleeding heart for somebody else. It's time to change.
We're all in this. So the United States can't pull itself out by running a trade surplus unless we can find another planet to sell to.
We remain totally unlike Japan, the place where everyone in the world wants to come and the place where everyone in the world wants to put their money.
We created colonialism, we created fascism, we created communism. Every bad thing was in Europe, and we make 2 world wars.
Nor are we in the House of Commons.
Oh, so what? Big deal. Neil, with a performance like that, you'll get there, I promise you.
If you get sick and you choose to go to the United States, you die sooner, you have a higher risk of fatal medical error.
This innovation and technology and research and cures for Alzheimer's and cures for HIV someday is going to come from the United States of America. It's not going to come from Canada.
Imagine indeed a world without religious faith. Not just no place of worship, no prayer, no scripture, but no men or women who, because of their faith, dedicating their lives to others.
Once you assume a creator and a plan, it makes us objects in a cruel experiment, and over us to supervise this is installed a celestial dictatorship, a kind of divine North Korea.
I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Dr. Kissinger, you have 6 minutes.
Would Africa be better off if China didn't invest there?
No, I'm not
Would
saying
Africa be better off if China wasn't its
biggest
biggest trading partner? I think that's the kind of hypocritical argument that if I were Chinese, I'd find quite annoying.
You're obviously finding it annoying even though you're not Chinese. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Munk Debate on Iran's. Thank you. Thank you. This is the Munk Debate on Iran's nuclear ambitions. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. It's my privilege to both organize these series and once again act as your moderator. We began tonight with a look back at some of the memorable moments of previous Munk Debates, because tonight is a special evening for this series. Tonight we convene our 10th semi-annual Munk Debate. On the Munk Debate stage, as we enter our 5th year, we've hosted over 38 speakers. Speakers such as Christopher Hitchens, Tony Blair, Henry Kissinger, who could forget him, Paul Krugman, and Larry Summers. And it's really thanks to you, the 3,000 people here at Roy Thompson Hall, again tonight for a Munk Debate, the thousands more watching online, all of you representing our 30,000 strong membership. This debate series, undeniably, is making a lasting contribution to more and better public debate, not only in Canada, but internationally. We're doing that through global TV and radio broadcasts on the BBC, through our homegrown champions, supporters of this debate, CBC Radio and the Globe and Mail, and through a unique publishing program with the Nancy Books that has seen these debates translated into over a dozen languages and are published throughout the English-speaking world. It's undeniable that this series is having an international impact. All of this would not be possible, again, without you, our members, our attendees, and two other very special people. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a big round of applause for tonight, our 10th annual semi-annual debate, and the hosts and originators of this series, Peter and Melanie Monk and the Aurea Foundation. Bravo. 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 Okay, the moment we've been waiting for. Let's get our two teams of powerhouse debaters out onto this stage and our contest underway. Arguing for the motion, be it resolved, the world cannot tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons capability, are Charles Krauthammer and Major General retired Amos Yadlin. Well, given tonight is an anniversary of sorts for the Monk debates, who better to have on stage than one of the debaters from our winning team in our very first debate in 2008. He writes a must-read column in the Washington Post on U.S. and international politics. It's syndicated in over 150 newspapers around the world. His acerbic, I would call it acerbic, analysis and steely reputation on Fox News for not suffering fools gladly has made him one of America's most influential commentators. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charles Krauthammer. Well, given recent events in the Middle East, we are very fortunate indeed to host as Charles's debating partner an individual whose career in the Israeli Defense Force was synonymous with the nuclear threats that have confronted his country. Highlights include being one of 8 F-16 pilots who strapped themselves into jets and destroyed the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981, to most recently, up until 2010, playing a key role in managing Israel's overt and covert campaign against Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Ladies and gentlemen, Major General retired Amos Yadlin. Now, let's get out on this stage the equally formidable duo who will be arguing against tonight's resolution, be it resolved, the world cannot tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons capability, Vali Nasser and Fareed Zakaria. Well, Dean Vali Nasser leads Johns Hopkins University's prestigious School of Advanced International Studies. Born in Tehran, he's one of the world's top experts on the political and social development of Iran. And he's the author of 2 best-selling books, The Shia Revival and Democracy in Iran. He sits on the State Department's influential Foreign Affairs Policy Board and has served as a senior advisor as recently as 2011 for Afghanistan and Pakistan to the late Richard Holbrooke, a former Monk debater. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Vali Nasser. Now, when you think of provocative conversation on the big foreign policy challenges of the day, you have to think about our next debater. His flagship global affairs program on CNN is seen in over 200 countries worldwide, but he is anything but a talking head on cable TV. He writes a highly respected column for the Washington Post and is the editor-at-large of Time magazine. His numerous best-selling books include The Post-American World and The Future of Freedom. Please welcome back to the Monk Debate stage broadcaster and journalist Fareed Zakaria. Now, we are just moments from getting our debate underway, but before we hear from opening statements, once again, I'm going to need this audience's assistance as the night goes on to make sure our debaters stay on time in terms of their opening and closing remarks, and that we move forward as a debate together. So you will see this countdown clock, this handy clock appear. When it reaches 0, applaud. This will let our debaters know that their time is over for their opening and closing statements. And finally, before we kick off the debate, let's see how the 3,000 people gathered today in Roy Thomson Hall voted on our resolution, be it resolved, the world cannot tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons. This is as you took your seats. Let's see those numbers there. Debaters, you'll have it on your projection screen here. 60% in favor of the motion, 23% opposed, 17% undecided. Now, we all answered a second question. Depending on what you hear during the debate, are you open to changing your vote? How many proverbial swing states do we have in the audience this evening? Let's see those results. Wow, that's different. Past Munk debates, we've seen even higher levels of potential vote changing. So this debate is very much in play. Now, time for opening statements. And as we've agreed to the order, Dr. Charles Krauthammer, you're up first.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. There are nice introductions, there are kind introductions. The nice ones are where they list all your achievements. They get a copy made and notarized, and they send it to your mother. The kind introductions are the ones where they leave stuff out. For example, I appreciate you leaving out the fact that I once worked for the famously liberal Senator Walter Mondale. People ask me, wrong reaction. People sometimes ask me, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? I tell them it's easy, I was young once. It's also, I appreciate the fact you left out that I was once a psychiatrist. In fact, technically I still am. But in reality, I'm a psychiatrist in remission. Doing extremely well, thank you. I haven't had a relapse in 25 years. I'm sometimes asked to compare what I do as a political analyst in Washington with what I do now, what I did back then as a psychiatrist in Boston. And I tell people, as you can imagine, it's not that different. In both lines of work, I deal every day with people who suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. The only difference is that in Washington, the paranoids have access to nuclear weapons, which makes the stakes a little higher, the work a little more interesting, and which leads us to tonight's debate. Nuclear weapons in the hands of a regime like Iran's. Can we live with it? And the answer is no. I will give you 3 reasons to start off the debate why I think so, and then we'll get into the details as we go on. I'm sure you will enforce the 6-minute rule. The first reason, and I think we have to look at this in concentric circles of decreasing size, the global, the regional, and the local effect. The global problem, the global threat is that the world has been for 60 years trying to curtail and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Hyper-proliferation is the ultimate world nightmare. We congratulated ourselves when Brazil and Argentina announced nuclear weapons. Imagine what a world would be like where Iran, the most important, most powerful, most aggressive, and according to the State Department, the greatest exporter of terror in the world, the most aggressive state, most radical state in the Middle East, acquires nuclear weapons. That is the end of non-proliferation. Do you think the weaker nations in the region are going to take refuge in the parchment of the NPT treaty? No. Here's what will happen. Uncontrollable nuclear proliferation throughout a region roiled by revolution and sectarian blood feud. Those are the words of Henry Kissinger, who knows something about deterrence, when it works and when it doesn't. We will get an instant nuclear arms race. All the important neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Syria. Think of Syria. God knows who will be in charge of Syria. We'll all have gone nuclear, assuming that Iran will go nuclear first. And it's not just in the immediate Middle East. This is going to spread in the region. Our opponents tonight are going to speak reassuringly about deterrence. Well, the experience that we've had is the stable deterrence in a bipolar system, United States, Soviet Union, a bilateral stable system. Imagine that you have to do a deterrence with 6, 7, 8 powers, countries that are unstable, some revolutionary, and with shifting alliances. How do you enforce or rely on deterrence in those circumstances? You can get accidental or unauthorized use, you can get theft, you can get the deliberate proliferation into the hands of terrorists. Imagine if Al-Qaeda would do what it did on 9/11, if it would hesitate for a second, if it got its hands on nukes in using a nuclear weapon in such an attack in the future. That's the threat, that's the end of non-proliferation, and the end of a reliance on deterrence. Second, we have always tried to prevent a hegemon rising in the Middle East in control of the world's oil and control of this strategically important region. That's why there was an Iraq war in 1991 over the invasion of Kuwait. What the Arabs understand in the region is that once Iran is nuclear, it becomes the hegemon of the region, the most aggressive, radically Islamist, anti-Western state in charge of the strategic area of the Middle East. That's why the Gulf states, in private, have beseeched the United States to take out the nuclear program in advance, and why, if Israel were ever to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, the Saudis would line the desert with directional arrows saying, "This way to Tehran." Now, lastly, and I'm running out of time, I hope perhaps you'll desist from applauding at the 6-minute mark, or at least the 60% of you who are sympathetic to our view. Drown out the others. Is that this is a regime that has threatened to annihilate Israel and expressed its intention to do so. We are told we have to rely on deterrence because it worked in the Cold War. The Cold War was radically different. The Soviets had an ideological argument with the United States. It was not existential. And the target, the United States, was a continental nation of great size. Israel is a one-bomb country. That's a very strong 27%. I commend you on your energy there. I will stop here and say there's a radical difference between the Soviet-U.S. relationship and the relationship of Israel and Iran, and you will not ask 6 million Jews in Israel to rely for their existence on deterrence in this kind of situation. Thank you very much.
Charles, if it makes you feel any better, Henry Kissinger didn't get away with it either. So up next, Dean Valley-Nasser, the podium is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure being here. Let me start by saying that it goes without saying that the world would be better off if Iran does not become a nuclear-armed state. And achieving that goal should be our principal aim going forward. However, despite our best efforts, that undesirable end may very well come to pass. But should we act as if this is the first time that we've encountered such a challenge, or that the logic of containment and deterrence somehow does not apply to Iran, that Iran is a breed apart outside of the realm of politics as we know it? The answer is no. As troublesome and menacing as Iran has been, its behavior still reflects the pursuit of national interest. It has a strategy, it pursues it, and in the course of doing so, it reacts to incentives and pressure. We don't approve of its methods, but we understand its goals. In short, Iran is a familiar problem, one with which we have plenty of experience. During the Cold War, we managed peace and prosperity in Europe and Asia, containing both nuclear-armed Soviet Union and China. We may parse details as to what the similarities are in the Middle East, but the principle is very clear. And we are still guaranteeing peace and prosperity in Asia by containing a very dangerous North Korean regime that is armed with nuclear weapons and on a weekly basis threatens to set Seoul on fire. India, too, has been prospering while tolerating a grave nuclear danger from a country neighboring, which is known for its instability, adventurism, and support for terrorism. And that situation has been going on for over two decades, and yet there is a stable containment situation in which the Indian economy has been prospering. It is often argued that Iran is different because the Iranian regime is irrational and it's messianic, so much so that it's impervious to the logic of containment and deterrence. It is assumed that Iran's singular aim is to start a nuclear Armageddon the minute that it acquires nuclear weapons, that it is actually religiously mandated to do so. There are plenty of American politicians that believe in the rapture, but that does not mean that you can read American foreign policy on the basis of that suggestion. If Iranians were truly driven by messianism in their foreign policy, they would have reacted when the shrine most directly associated with their hidden imam was blown up in Iraq in 2006, and yet they didn't. The last time Iran attacked a neighbor was in 1859 to reclaim Afghan territories that were snatched away by Great Britain. The record of the past 3 decades shows that as objectionable and problematic as Iran's behavior has been, it is still driven by the cold calculations of regime survival and national interest. You don't need a degree in Islamic studies to understand Iranian strategy or to conclude that the regime that has survived in power for 3 decades could not be suicidal or completely reckless. In fact, despite its bluster and support for terrorism, Iran has been more accepting of international norms than was the case with communist China or is the case with North Korea or even Pakistan. We talk about the proliferation issue, but let us remember, it was Pakistan, while in America's tight embrace, and not Iran, that began to acting as a nuclear eBay. If we are to say that we will not tolerate a nuclear Iran if that becomes the case, then we have to basically say we're prepared to go down the path to war with Iran. We should ask ourselves, can we tolerate another major war in the Middle East? This time with a country that is twice as large, twice as populous as Iraq, has much larger landmass, that its capital city is 2,000 kilometers and 2 mountain ranges away from the nearest port facilities. Will that war actually be effective? Will it get the job done? How long will that war take? 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? Longer? How much would it cost? How many more trillions of dollars would this war cost the United States? How many Americans would die in such a war? 10,000? 15,000? More? How would such a war impact the Middle East, or America for that matter? Do we want such a war? Can we tolerate it? It seems that Americans have already answered this from the president on down. They have answered these questions very clearly, and it's a resounding no. They don't want such a war. The good news is that they don't have to have it. If it becomes necessary, if the efforts, diplomatic efforts, the sanctions to stop Iran in its tracks were to fail, we can manage a nuclear Iran, just as we managed a nuclear Soviet Union, Communist China, North Korea, and Pakistan. Thank you.
Well, the debate is shaping up nicely. Next up is Amos Yadlin. Amos, the podium is yours.
It is 2 a.m. in Tel Aviv, and I'm the only one who is not speaking English every day. But it is much more frightening to have a real gun barrel pointed directly at your face than watching it on CNN or reading about it in the Washington Post. Last week, Israel was showered with 1,500 rockets and missiles from Gaza, aimed at Israeli innocent people, innocent citizens, women, and children. Those were Iranian rockets and missiles that were supplied to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Thanks God, they were not nuclear missiles. Iranian leaders are the only state leaders calling for destruction of a UN member state. The supreme leader, the president, the chief of staff are using daily expressions like annihilation, cancer removal, wipe off the map, and they pointed at Israel. The Iranian leaders are also Holocaust deniers. Our grandparents in Europe 70 years ago, in their wildest dream, never imagined that Hitler intended to do exactly what he has said. I suggest that we take these current Iranian threats very, very seriously. Why? Because Iran has a cruel and radical regime, both regarding internal and external issues. They hang 16-year-old gays on cranes publicly. They torture their own citizens and kill them in prison. You know the Canadian photographer who was arrested, tortured, raped, and killed in Iranian prison. They tampered with election result and cracked down on the opposition. Iran is also #1 sponsor of state global terror. And for many years, they do exercise terror all over the world. In the 80s, in Beirut, they bombed through Hezbollah, the US embassy. They have killed more than 200 Marine soldiers in the Marine barracks in Beirut. The Israeli embassy in the 19th in Buenos Aires, as well as the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. And what they are doing today in Syria, supporting Assad, killing more than 30,000 people of his own citizens. This is the Iranians. They back every negative regime in the world. And imagine Iran possessing nuclear weapons. Will this be passed on to terrorists, just as the best Iranian weapons have made their way to Hezbollah? Hezbollah is the only terror organization in the world with ballistic missiles and UAV drones bombers. Why is there not Iranian nuclear weapons? But this is not only the terror aspect. A nuclear Iran will be the end of NPT as we know it. And the Middle East will become even worse neighborhood. Saudi Arabia, they really care. They're concerned about the nuclear Iran, more than Israel. They will go to Pakistan the next day. They already paid for the bomb. They only have to bring it back home to their Chinese missiles. Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, every country who believed to be a regional superpower will go nuclear. Nuclear balance that will include many participants is not stable. And if it's just Israel against Iran, the main concept of MAD, mutual assured destruction, that basically stable the Cold World War is not there anymore, because there is no communication between Iran and Israel. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that time, the Soviet Union has an embassy in Washington, D.C. Bobby Kennedy, the brother of the president, went to Dobrynin, the ambassador in the Soviet embassy in D.C., and they closed a deal how to de-escalate a war that was about to have a nuclear war. There is no Iranian embassy in Israel. There is no red line between the Prime Minister's office and the Supreme Leader. The world must stop Iran. This is not an Israeli problem. The Iranian regime is stand against everything and every value we stand for. Freedom, human rights, rule of law, women's rights, everything. Last word. If you believe to the international press and David Singer's new books about covert campaigns, I am the only one in the world who had taken part in 3 counter-proliferation operations. 2 were very successful. 2 were very successful and spared the world from nuclear weapons in the hands of cruel, bloody 30 dictators. The 3rd counter-proliferation campaign, the international community must take care of. Last, the barrel of gun, and this time a nuclear gun. We look at all of us squarely in the face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there you see on display the discipline of an IDF officer who always completes his mission, regardless of the casualties. Fareed Zakaria, you're up next. Final opening statement.
Thank you so much. I really understand the position of the opposing team. I understand the fear. I understand the danger. I understand the challenge. Let me put this in some historical perspective. After the Cold War, the United States was the only country in the world with nuclear weapons. And then the Soviet Union acquired a nuclear weapon. And there were many people who felt, many very serious people, that this was an absolute calamity and that the only recourse the United States had was a preemptive war against Russia, against the Soviet Union. This was a position not held by wacky warmongers. Bertrand Russell, the pacifist philosopher, argued in favor for that. Harold Nicholson, the cool, unsentimental British diplomat, argued in favor of that. But a man like Dwight Eisenhower understood that rollback, a strategy of preemptive war, would have huge costs and undergo huge consequences. And so he opted instead for a strategy called deterrence and containment. Keep the Soviet Union in a box, put pressure on them so that they found it difficult to operate, and maintain the deterrence that says to them, if you try to do something, you yourself will be annihilated. Now remember, the Soviet Union at the time was regarded as a wild, crazy, revolutionary power bent on global revolution. Remember that Stalin had just sacrificed tens of millions of his people in World War II in the Eastern Front, something that was unfathomable to Western statesmen. They were routinely called irrational, crazy, wide-eyed, messianic, all the things you've heard about Iran. But we learned that the proper course of action was not rollback and a preemptive war, but containment and deterrence. Then we watched this again in China. John Kennedy feared that if China went nuclear, 25 countries would go nuclear. Well, China did go nuclear. And Mao was truly crazy. Mao openly talked about the need for a nuclear war. He said it would cause sacrifices, but it would be educational. And he said half the world will be destroyed, but the other half will be socialist. Now that's a crazier, more messianic comment than anything the Iranian mullahs have ever said. And yet, what we learned was that Mao could be contained and deterred. And then, as Vali mentioned, we watched this in the country I grew up in India. India and Pakistan fought a war every 15 years after independence. They fought 3 wars in 30 years. And then they got nuclear weapons. And in the last 40 years, they haven't fought a war since. Now, every time you will, of course, see tensions and you will see crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because these powers are in conflict with one another. But what's extraordinary is that during the Cold War, despite this intense geopolitical rivalry, which would have told you, all history would have suggested that the United States and Soviet Union would have gone to war with one another. They didn't because of nuclear weapons, because they were deterred, because of the fear of what it would mean. Margaret Thatcher understood this. In 1989, she gave a speech standing with Mikhail Gorbachev, and she said, "You and I, Mr. Secretary General, know that conventional weapons have never deterred war in Europe, but nuclear weapons have done so for 40 years. she said in 1989. Make that 70 years. North Korea, when it went nuclear, we were told all of Asia was going to go nuclear. Japan would go nuclear. South Korea would go nuclear. You could understand why. South Korea is still in a state of active arms. It's at war with North Korea. And yet that hasn't happened. South Korea hasn't gone nuclear. Japan hasn't gone nuclear. What the lesson of North Korea has been, if you're a third-rate dysfunctional country that manages to acquire a couple of crude nuclear devices, you remain a third-world dysfunctional country with a couple of crude nuclear devices. Power does not flow from the barrel of crude nuclear weapons. It flows from your GDP, from your innovation, from your technological prowess. And so we come to Israel, and we come to the challenge that Iran places there. And what I would argue is that the Iranians, as Vali has pointed out, are cool, calculating, shrewd, far more so in their rhetoric and in their actions, certainly in their actions, than any of the regimes we are talking about. They will be deterred. They will be deterred by Israel's 200 to 500 nuclear weapons. Remember, Israel has many on submarines so that they have second strike capacity. They will be deterred by America's vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. And recall, they don't have any yet. We're talking about a hypothetical situation. And yet what we are talking about is a war in the Middle East where we would go and strike a regime preemptively. And what would happen? The regime would gain support at home. Every regime that has ever been attacked by foreigners preemptively has the effect of rallying people around that regime. We would be able to destroy part of the infrastructure, but they would be able to rebuild it very quickly. Israel's own estimates are that they would delay the program by 2 years. You would radicalize the Middle East and turn the mullahs and this regime into a much more popular force in the Middle East than it is now. Meanwhile, we have a containment strategy and a deterrence strategy. We have enormous pressure on them. The sanctions have been crippling their economy. They have not been able to develop a nuclear weapon. The Israeli intelligence that I have received in my 10 years as a journalist, every year for the last 10 years, I have been told that Iran is 1 year away from getting a nuclear bomb. Either Israeli intelligence is very bad, or we have been very good at deterring and containing Iran.
Well, there's a professional broadcaster for you. 1 second to spare. Well done, Fareed. Well, look, there's so much that we need to discuss, from proliferation to deterrence. But what I think is on the mind of many people, gentlemen, in this room tonight is what's happened in the last number of weeks, the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And Vali Nasser, let's have you begin this. I mean, you've argued in a sense that Iran is seeking to acquire a nuclear device to dominate the Arab world, not destroy Israel. Yet, as we heard from General Yadlin, those very missiles, those very long-range missiles that were fired for the first time by Hamas and Islamic Jihad on Jerusalem and on Tel Aviv were proudly provided by Iran. So why is General Yadlin wrong about the intent of destruction, and why are you right about the impetus towards domination?
Well, first of all, Iran and Israel have been in a low-level warfare with one another over a number of decades. General Yadlin referred to the back and forth over what happened in South Lebanon with the bombing, and then the retaliations that Iran did in Argentina. There have been attacks on Israel here and there. And currently, as we're speaking, there are cyber attack operations on Iran, as well as also assassination of their scientists. They're also hitting back. But launching nuclear weapon is a whole different order of magnitude in terms of escalation, particularly against a country which has several hundred nuclear warheads with much more accurate ability to deliver them. And as Fareed said, with a second strike capability off of submarines, Iran is in no way in a position to be able to take Israel on at that level. Now, of course, Iran would brandish these missiles very proudly. It wants to change the conversation in the Middle East from Syria and itself to the Arab-Israeli issue. It wants to also tell the Arabs that it's providing ammunition to the Palestinians to stand up to Israel. It has, in the past week, it has got a lot of ground in the Arab world because of these two things, because the limelight has shifted from them and what they're doing in Syria to the Arab-Israeli issue, and also because it's seen as the only government in the region that is providing material support to the Palestinians. Again, it's cold calculation about what would promote their position in the region.
Charles, it sounds rational, cold, calculated, moving forward to shift attention away from what's happening in Syria. Why don't you buy that analysis?
This argument that Iran is acting purely from nationalist motives, cold and calculating, simply makes no sense in relation to Israel. Iran and Israel were allies, friends until the revolution. There's nothing intrinsic about Iranian national interest that drives it to want to destroy Israel. It is precisely the ideology of the mullahs. It is precisely the theology of the mullahs. It is precisely the idea that the revolution, as Ayatollah Khomeini explained, the revolution in Iran was the harbinger, the beginning, the spark for the return of the 12th Mahdi, the restoration of the caliphate, and the restoration of Islam's place in the world. And in order to achieve that, as they have been saying for the last year, for example, the destruction of Israel is the beginning of the redemption of humanity. Is that nationalism speaking? Is that national interest speaking? The other side is trying to pretend that somehow the Iranian regime is cold and calculating and nationalist. Then why is it risking everything by supplying arms to Hezbollah and to Hamas? How does that promote the Iranian national interest? To involve itself in the civil war in Syria, where they are becoming hated by the Sunni Arabs because they are arming and protecting and even sending revolutionary guards into Syria to kill, imprison, and to torture Sunni Muslims trying to achieve freedom in Syria. No, this is a highly ideologically driven regime, and at the top of its ideological and theological list is the annihilation of Israel. And our opponents are saying, oh, it's rhetoric, it's stuff, this is a nation only interested in its own national interest. It's plainly the opposite.
Let's have Fareed come back on this critical point of what the most recent conflict between Gaza and Israel says.
There are 2 points. Let me answer Charles's question first. The reason the Iranians espouse the Palestinian cause so vociferously is because this is a Shiite Persian regime that is trying to have dominance in the Middle East. How do you do that with a bunch of Arabs? By appropriating their most important cause. If you go to the streets of Cairo, which I have done many times, what is striking is that when you talk to shopkeepers, the photograph they have in the shop is of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a Shiite Persian. And you ask them, why do you have that photograph? And they say, well, because he supports the Palestinians. The Iranian regime very cannily understands that by appropriating the cores of the Arab street, they are in effect outwitting the Arab regimes themselves. They are saying to the Arab street, your governments are too scared of Washington to support the Palestinians fully. We will support them. And it gives them enormous street credibility. And by the way, it is what makes Arab countries very scared of publicly opposing Iran's rise to power. To your question, what does the Gaza incursion tell us? The Gaza incursion tells us one thing very clearly, particularly if you look at the reaction of Egypt and Turkey. There is now a new Middle East, and Israel is the superpower in that Middle East. The Egyptians, under a new government, we were told, were going to be different. They were Islamists. They were ideological. You know, these guys, Muslims are crazy, and then you put one of them in power like that, and you know what's going to happen. Well, guess what he did? He followed the Mubarak policy, which is basically to try to broker a deal between Hamas and Israel. And why did he do that? Because Israel's defense budget today is larger than that of all its neighbors put together. That doesn't even begin to get into the technological advantages it has, the qualitative advantages. It has the enormous advantage of being the only country in the Middle East that has sophisticated nuclear weapons on sophisticated delivery systems. And so when confronting that, yes, the Turks will make very fine speeches in favor of the Palestinians, and the Egyptians will shed crocodile tears, but none of them will do anything because, if I may say it in a word, they are deterred. If Israel did not believe in deterrence, why has it gone through the enormous expense of building a nuclear arsenal? It's presumably to deter its enemies, not to use it.
Amos, let's bring that direct point to you, because some people have commented that what the conflict between Israel and Gaza suggests is, in fact, that Israel needs some deterrence on its military action, its range of military action, to force it to a negotiating table to find a solution for negotiation, not through conflict. How do you respond to that line of argument?
I think we have to go back to Iran. I don't know what we are doing in Gaza right now, because we're speaking about Iran. And basically, the argument that the Cold War deterrence principles are going to work in the Middle East are wrong. Because just listen to Rafsanjani. You know who is Rafsanjani? He was the president of Iran. And what he have said, that Israel is a one-bomb country, very tiny, very small. And the proud Islamic nation can absorb 3 to 4 bombs. Is that deterrence? No, it's not. And you know, when the Americans and the Soviets were doing deterrence calculations, both of them have lived in this world. And they want to continue to live in this world. We have a business with people who think about the second world, a second life. They invented the suicide bombers. They sent kids to open field mines in the war with Iraq. These people are rational, but it's not our rational. It's different. They have to call somebody over there, and I'm very, very worried about the way they are making their decisions.
Okay, let's spend one more moment on this before moving on to the question of proliferation, because that's a big one. But Vali, you've written a series of books on Iran. It's a country from which you were born. Why is Yadlin wrong to think that there is this irrational, messianic force, maybe not amongst the Iranian people, but amongst the elite and the leadership who could make the decision of whether to engage in a nuclear conflict or not?
Well, the fact that people are willing to die for a cause is not unique to Muslims. You know, during World War II, you had Japanese kamikazes do it. Suicide bombing is the poor man's missile system. And it's been proven very effective. And that's the reason it's being used. Secondly, rulers always can manipulate the popular beliefs of foot soldiers to get them to sacrifice themselves for a greater cause. It's not unique to Iran. It's happened all over the world. And not only in Iran, across the Muslim world, the foot soldier who's willing to commit suicide for a cause, can believe in anything, but the generals don't believe in that. The Iranian leaders are old men. They didn't get to that age by actually believing in suicide bombing. They didn't carry it. Not one of them carried it against the Shah's regime. Not one of them has sent his own sons to carry out the suicide regimes. Yes, of course, General Yadlin is right in the fact that the morality and ethics of this regime are abhorrent, and they use, obviously, poor, uneducated, fanatical kids to achieve their strategic objectives. But, there is no evidence that Iranian rulers actually make their calculations on the basis of wishing to expedite their own departure to the next world.
Very good. Okay, let's move on to the theme of nuclear proliferation, because it's a key one. And to do that, over the last week or so, we've caught up with a few international policy thinkers to get their reflections on this debate, and we're going to bring them to you in the form of video clips now. The first of these was Senator George Mitchell, who we spoke to in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. He's the former U.S. Senate Majority Leader, but more importantly, he was Barack Obama's U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace until 2011. Let's listen to that clip, and then I'm going to have Charles react.
Thank you, Rudyard, and good evening. The debate on this subject has tended to focus on the threat to Israel from a nuclear-armed Iran. That's a serious concern which I share, and I'm sure it will be discussed this evening. There's another aspect of the subject that I think deserves discussion as well, and that's the threat to the nuclear non-proliferation regime, or stated more simply, the danger of the rapid spread of nuclear weapons to many countries. the United States led the world into the nuclear age, and ever since has also led the effort to restrain the spread of these highly destructive weapons, with some success. In the half-century since the first atomic bomb was exploded over the desert in New Mexico, 9 countries have come to possess nuclear weapons. But the number of countries with the capability to possess those weapons is many times more than 9. Those countries which have voluntarily refrained from developing nuclear weapons, one of which, of course, is Canada, have relied instead on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and on American leadership. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, that could change. It could trigger an arms race in the Middle East as several countries there move quickly to get their weapon. And it's already a highly volatile and very dangerous place. Right now, Israelis and Palestinians are dying. The ancient hostility between Persians and Arabs remains high, as does the internal conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which has gone on since the founding of Islam.
Okay, Charles, it was a big part of your opening argument, the case for stopping Iran to allow the Non-Proliferation Treaty to continue. Go deeper on that for us. Why do you think this particular region is so different than the examples that Fareed and Nasser have given with China, with Russia, with India and Pakistan, and most recently with North Korea?
Because the conditions, geopolitical conditions, are radically different, and they keep referring back to this stable Cold War deterrence in a bilateral relationship between 2 established world powers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. First of all, the nostalgia is slightly overdone. Anybody who lived through October 1962 knows how close a run thing it was, how close we came within hours of a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So even this, the great one example of how we can live with this indefinitely, shows, and Kissinger himself talked about this, how inherently unstable it is. It's the only alternative once the Soviets have 10,000 weapons, and the U.S. also does. There is no alternative. But we're now in a situation in history where Iran has none, and we can avoid that. Avoid a Cuban Missile Crisis, which would be at a much higher elevated level if Iran ever went nuclear. Why would we choose a world in which Iran, this unstable, extremist, Islamist, aggressive power, would possess these weapons, a country that declares its intention to annihilate a member state of the UN? And you will have noticed that our opponents said nothing about the issue of hyperproliferation. They keep referring to this single example, the stable bilateral deterrence. But what will happen in the Middle East, as everybody understands, you will get all these countries, small, but some of them rich, some technologically advanced, developing nukes, and then we have a situation where you go from nuclear checkers, which is really easy, US and Soviets, to three-dimensional chess, shifting alliances, revolutionary governments, unstable regimes. Imagine in the hands of 7 or 8 of these countries nuclear weapons, countries where they could easily have accidental or unauthorized use. They don't have a tradition of civilian control of nuclear weapons as in the West. How easy it would be to turn one officer or another, as we see in Afghanistan every day, an officer, Afghan, will turn on a Western ally. And there's also the issue of
Charles,
the
I've
regime
got a flurry
demise.
of signals here of people that want in on this. So I'm going to go quickly to Fareed, then to Amos, and then to Nasser.
Well, it turns out we have an actual historical experiment as to whether or not there is proliferation in the Middle East. You see, it turns out there was a Middle East that had no nuclear weapons, and then one Middle Eastern power introduced nuclear weapons into the Middle East. The name of that country is, of course, Israel. Israel now has close, as I said, between 200 and 500, depending on whom you believe, very sophisticated weapons. As it turns out, none of the countries surrounding Israel, which are technically still at war with Israel, have gone nuclear as a result of that. So if the hyperproliferation scenario that Charles is so devoted to were true, why is it that when their sworn enemy, the country that the opposing team keeps reminding us the Arabs hate and want to get rid of, got nuclear weapons, it did not trigger proliferation?
Let me answer that.
The truth of the matter is every country that has received some kind of security guarantee from the United States has not chosen to proliferate. That's true of Japan, that's true of South Korea, that's true of Canada. The touching faith in the Non-Proliferation Treaty from Charles Krauthammer is rich. The truth of the matter is the reason that people are not proliferating is because they get guarantees from the United States, guarantees that the United States has provided to the moderate Arab states, and of course has provided to Israel. But you asked
wait a minute.
A quick rebuttal
You
from
asked
Charles.
a question. Is it a rhetorical, or were you asking a real question?
Well, you were asking several, so if yours were rhetorical,
you asked,
mine are rhetorical, if yours are real.
Why is it that when Israel acquires a nuclear weapon, you don't get hyperproliferation? The answer is easy and simple. Israel has no intention to annihilate a neighboring country.
Oh.
Do you think Egyptians, do you think Egypt, Saudi Arabia live in terror that one day out of the blue, Israel is going to destroy Cairo or Riyadh? No,
Correct.
the reason that the Israeli weapon is not a threat and doesn't cause...
So Charles, let me understand this. Egypt, which has fought 3 wars with Israel, isn't worried about a war with Israel.
You can ask rhetoricals and make a speech, or you can ask and I'll give you the answer. Everybody understands in the region, Israel is not going to start nuclear aggression. It's inconceivable. Whereas Iran, which is intervening in Gaza, arming in Hezbollah, intervening in Syria and elsewhere, is a nation that when it threatens to annihilate another, people take seriously. And the Saudis aren't acting or pretending or being cynical when they say if Iran
Okay,
goes
Charles,
into
let's,
nuclear,
we have a lot of people. Hold on a second. I want equal time for all the debaters. So I'm going to go to Vali Nasser, then back to you, Amos. So we're going to give each side a chance on this.
First of all, as you've already said, threat is in the eyes of the beholder. And the Arab countries do take Israel's nuclear capabilities as a strategic game changer. Maybe not annihilation, but it's a strategic game changer. But there is no evidence that actually hyper-proliferation would happen. It seems to be more of an American argument in order to basically argue against the case of Iran going nuclear. In fact, it looks like we've done more to goad countries to try to say that they want to go nuclear. We're supporting Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all of them to establish nuclear facilities. And I don't think actually countries can easily build nuclear capability in the Middle East. Iran's nuclear program goes back several decades to the time of the Shah. Most of these countries we're talking about don't have the infrastructure to build a nuclear weapons program. And as General Yadlin said, okay, Saudi Arabia can go to Pakistan and get it. Then what are we doing here? These 2 countries are our allies. UAE is our ally. We have much more leverage to prevent proliferation in this region than we had with Iran. To me, it seems we're making the case for all of these countries to go nuclear because it proves our case against Iran. But there's no real evidence for it.
Okay, General?
Yeah, I think the fact that you repeat and repeat again and repeat again a lie is not making it a true. And I'm speaking about the number of bombs that Israel has. Israel declares that it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Israel is the only country that under a threat that it will be wiped off the map. I don't recognize any other country in the Middle East. And whenever our neighbors will make peace with us, I guess even the capabilities that we have will not be there. So Israel behaved very responsibly. As Farid have said, we have 4 wars with Egypt and never spoke about anything beside conventional weapons. So it's a different behavior if you compare it to the way the Iranians are speaking and what they are doing. And I describe what they are doing all over the Middle East, and you cannot ignore it. Vali, you know, and you read, as I read, the WikiLeaks. And the Saudis are saying, we are not going to tolerate a nuclear Iran. And believe me, they are your allies, but they don't trust you anymore. They don't trust you because of what happened in Egypt. They don't trust you because you are not stopping Iran from becoming nuclear. They don't trust you because of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And they will become nuclear, no doubt about it. And we already spoke about a multi-player balance in the Middle East, which is so unstable and so dangerous that it's not only us that don't want to live in this neighborhood. It's you that don't want to live in this neighborhood. Because when Iran will be the hegemon, the price of oil will be $200, $300 a barrel, and it will stay there forever. So it's your problem, it's not ours.
Two final interventions on this point. We're going to go to Fareed, and then Charles, you'll have the last word, and we'll move on to another topic.
I think it's very important for us to have a conversation about what happens if the strategy that the opposing team wants takes place. That is to say, we're living in a world of bad choices. That's the world of international relations. That's the world of international politics. You don't have wonderful, clean solutions that make the problem go away. So imagine the scenario. What we do is the United States and or Israel goes and engages in the third Middle Eastern war in a decade. We go and strike Iran. What is going to happen?
We haven't suggested this, by the way.
If we cannot tolerate it, the logical consequence is one you will have to live with. So let's play it out. What will happen is that the regime will get strengthened. It happens everywhere. 1 week after 9/11, George Bush's approval ratings were 91%. The Green Movement will be destroyed in Iran. The regime will be able to rebuild its capabilities very easily. The nuclear budget for Iran for the nuclear civilian program is currently $300 million. They make about $50 billion off their oil revenues. This is a drop in the bucket. They will have radicalized the Middle East. They will have gained purchase on the Arab street. All this for a 2-year delay, for a 3-year delay. What are you then going to do? Bomb them every 2 years? Hope that one day, that somehow in our fantasy version, the country that we keep bombing turns into a moderate liberal democracy and suddenly embraces Western values? What is far more likely is, of course, that they will get radicalized, and they will get even more radicalized. Imagine if we had done what Charles wanted in the 1950s and had a rollback strategy. He says we couldn't do it with the Soviets once they got 10,000 missiles, but they didn't in the 50s, and there were many people arguing we should have had a preemptive war. Imagine what would have happened then. Imagine if we had done that in China and engaged in preemptive war with China. Would any of these regimes have mellowed? Would they have gotten integrated into the world the way they have? No, they would have been radicalized, violent, unstable regimes, and that is the fate we are condemning ourselves to if we launch another war in the Middle East.
Well, Charles, that has to be one of the nubs of this debate.
I'd like to answer the non-rhetorical.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to ask questions in here, we should at least accept that there might be an answer. Fareed is giving us this scenario of what will happen if and when Israel or the U.S. attacks, rallying to the government, destruction of the Green Movement. And he went on and on. He elaborated on all the details. The problem with his analysis is we have two actual empirical historical examples of exactly what he's talking about, the preemptive denuclearization of a country. General Yarin here beside me was involved in the first. He dropped the bombs on the first. Iraq, 1981. The reaction from Iraq, zero.
They rebuilt their nuclear program, however.
Did they go to war? Did they attack? Was there a rallying? No.
It took more than 2 years.
That's number one. Number two.
They rebuilt their nuclear program, precisely what I pointed out. When Gulf War happened, what the inspectors found was an Iraqi nuclear program, which had been built after Osirak.
They did not.
In 10 years, not 2 years.
This was 10 years later. The West went into Iraq and found that it had not rebuilt and created a bomb. So it gained a decade. Number two, in 2007, there was an attack on the Syrian facility from North Korea that was a nuclear facility. Reaction, zero. Syria didn't even announce the attack. Second, if we had not done that, if the Israelis, acting on behalf of the West, I would argue, had not done that, what would be happening in Syria today? The world is terrified about the loose chemical and biological weapons that are in Syria that we know are there, that the regime has declared, and that the jihadists and the al-Qaeda elements in Syria could easily acquire. That's why we're so vigilant, the United States standing on the border in Jordan as a way to preempt the transfer. The reason there are no nukes involved is because of the preemption. That's why the hyperproliferation is so important. And the blithe assurance that we get from our opponents that somehow there would be this great reaction to rallying to the regime. This regime in Iran is detested by the overwhelming majority of the people, and particularly by the young, as we saw in the Green Revolution. It was suppressed. If there were, for example, a U.S. attack that not only attacked nukes, but attacked elements of regime strength, like the Revolutionary Guards, that could be the occasion for a revival of the revolution. The Revolutionary Guards who tortured the young people in the streets are not heroes, and they would not become heroes had they, if they were to be the victims of a U.S. or Israeli attack on the nuclear facilities. I think it could have the opposite effect, galvanizing a population that hates an oppressive theological regime at a time where the regime would be at its weakest.
Nasser, and then to you. Just either side, back and forth, okay? Nasser, you're the expert on Iran. Tell us why that's not true.
First of all, to the first point, Syria and Iraq are not Iran. In terms of size, capability, location, size of population, amount of weight they have in the Middle East. The reaction for Iran could potentially be orders of magnitude different. Secondly, I don't know of any population that is going to side with the outsiders bombing its country, especially because this is not about democracy. We are not putting sanctions on Iran for democracy and human rights. We're not bombing Iran for democracy and human rights. We're bombing it and pressuring it for something that potentially the Iranian people actually believe in. It's their technology. Their government has told them this is for peaceful purposes. And the Iranians are probably as affectionate about their nuclear program as the Pakistanis or Indians are about theirs.
What about Libya last year?
Well, Libya is not Iran.
We bombed, and the population applauded us. You
were bombing them. You were bombing them not for the nuclear program. You were bombing them to protect them for the authoritarian regime.
You just said no government is attacked and the people rally on behalf of the attackers.
The pretext
I gave you an example that happened within a year.
No, the pretext matters. What makes you think the Iranians would rally? Does the example of 1953, when we intervened in Iran and the reaction we got suggests that the Iranians would side with us? Or the example of the Iran-Iraq war, when as soon as Saddam attacked, even the moderate, liberal, democratic population, they all hurried to the clerics.
Because they hate a regime that shoots young women in the street, tortures demonstrators, and then delivers the body to the family. That's why they would rally. If there were people who opposed their oppressors and their torturers. And when it happened in Libya, they rallied.
Are you saying Iran or Iraq? Did you get the last letter mixed up? Because we heard all this about the Iraq war. The Iraqis were going to love us because we were bombing them into freedom and democracy, and it didn't quite work out that way.
And who
I think you got the letter wrong. I just want to give our guest, who's come all the way from Israel here and is on 2 o'clock in the morning Tel Aviv time, a few moments. 3 o'clock, sir. I'm sorry, 3 o'clock. Some time on the stage. Go ahead.
I want to remind the audience the resolution today. The resolution is not whether to attack Iran or not. The resolution is whether the world can live with a nuclear Iran. And since they don't have arguments, they went to the attack. We are not suggesting attacking Iran. We suggest not let Iran be nuclear by having a tough sanctions, by doing everything that's short of war, and this was not done yet. Only in the last year, the world imposed a crippling sanctions. If we would have done it a decade ago, the question was not here by now. Because the regime is a hated regime. It's a hated regime. And I heard the argument, if you just sanction them, the people will rally behind the regime. Never happened. Never happened. The people hate the regime. There is no so many old Iranians. 65% of them are very young, and they never knew the Shah, and they blame the Islamic Republic for all the bad things in Iran. And I think the time that we will buy by tough sanctions will change the regime. And we are not calling to attacking Iran unless it's the last resort. And once again, I am not I'm not speaking on invading another country. What you have done in Iraq was a mistake. But you have a very good Air Force that can surgically solve the problem. I am not recommending it yet.
Well, let's move on to another topic area of this. And, you know, what is a Munk debate without a little bit of a contribution from Dr. Henry Kissinger? So we caught up with Dr. Kissinger in New York last week. Let's have a listen to his intervention in this debate. Roll tape.
Thank you, Rudyard. For a decade and a half, American presidents from both political parties have declared that an Iranian nuclear military capability is unacceptable and that no option is off the table in preventing it. If Iran emerges from this process, which was joined also by other members of the UN Security Council, with a military nuclear capability, the psychological and strategic balance in the region will be transformed. The countries of the region and elsewhere will look to the development of nuclear weapons for their own security. Non-proliferation as an international goal will be ended or severely jeopardized. The credibility of Western strategy will be severely damaged. It is essential that the United States and its allies define what they mean by Iranian nuclear military capability and what they mean by the term unacceptable.
Fareed, let me start with you. I want to zero in on that key line of what Dr. Kissinger said. The credibility of Western strategy will be severely damaged. Your president, in the context of this recent election, had to walk towards a red line on Iran that's very close to our resolution tonight. It's about capability. It's about the ability to assemble a device as opposed to a working device. In some ways, has the train already left the station? Is U.S. position able to walk back from what Dr. Krauthammer and General Yadlin are arguing?
Well, I think, first of all, how do you argue with that accent, right? He was my debate partner the last time we did the Munk debates, and so I naturally have great respect for him. I think that the United States' position on this issue, which is a somewhat technical point but worth going into, is understandably ambiguous. You do not want to signal in advance exactly at what point you would go to war. You know who else has exactly the same position? The government of Israel. Even though the Israeli Prime Minister has been asking Washington to draw a red line, Israel itself has not drawn a red line, and I would argue they are right not to draw a red line. You want to keep the other guy guessing. You want to keep the pressure on. You don't want to be entirely clear as to when, you don't want to give the other person your timetable for war. It's one thing if they do something, an action like invading a country that triggers an obvious response. But in a situation like this, we retain much more room to maneuver and much more flexibility if we maintain some degree of strategic ambiguity, as the Israelis are doing. It is important to point out the Iranians do not have nuclear weapons. And in fact, there is something worth pointing out here. Not only do they not have nuclear weapons, but the supreme leader of Iran has issued a fatwa, a religious edict, saying it would be un-Islamic to have them, and that the founder of the regime, Ayatollah Khomeini, believed it was un-Islamic to have nuclear weapons. Now, of course they could be lying, but it would be rather odd for a regime that relies on it for its legitimacy on religious edicts to unnecessarily issue these edicts. And nobody's asking them to say this stuff, right? So the fact that they are doing that also suggests that the Iran may have a complicated calculation of its own, that they want some kind of capacity, and that buys them a certain degree of influence, but they are not seeking to have an arsenal all ready to go. And that reality is the one we have to live with in trying to figure out exactly what Iranian action would trigger an American or Israeli response. And that's why the Americans and the Israelis, understandably, are maintaining that ambiguity.
Could I comment on that? Of course he could be lying. That's an interesting understatement. Here's a regime that, as Fareed has argued, has allowed its currency to depreciate by 60%, has had its economy completely wrecked, has been isolated because it's pursuing a nuclear program, and we are to believe that the Ayatollah saying, oh, we really aren't interested, ought to supersede what we see in front of our eyes.
Saddam Hussein
Here
did
is
all
a
those
regime,
things, and he didn't have a nuclear weapon, it turned out.
But and you think
he endured the worst
you
sanctions
think
in the world
Iran
rather
is
than
not,
capitulate to the West.
You think Iran is faking a nuclear program, or you think the facility outside of Bakum
I'm pointing out that Saddam Hussein did fake a nuclear
theatrical
program.
set? I'm talking about the real world, what's happening right now.
Saddam Hussein was in the real world, not in a fantasy. I don't know if you got that.
Saddam Hussein,
he faked that he had a nuclear weapon and
you're
endured
telling
crippling
us
sanctions.
that therefore,
one
minute,
now
you're saying that Iran is faking its nuclear program.
Do you remember there were two?
Is that what you're saying?
Pardon?
Both
of you were coming at me at the same time.
I'll ask you a question. Is Iran faking its nuclear program?
No, it has an active nuclear civilian program. I believe that serious Iranian scholars believe.
Them to the Security
Look,
Council?
you want an answer? Serious Iran scholars and intelligence analysts are unsure as to whether they have made a final decision that they want to weaponize completely, or do they want to stop short because that gets them most of the benefits, the influence that they seek, without actually incurring the costs. That is an issue on which, for example, American intelligence and Israeli intelligence
It's great
are
that you
both
brought that up,
divided.
because that's an absolutely key point.
Right.
And I want Amos Yadlin to respond to that. That this isn't.
And indeed, there are former heads of Mossad who agree with me.
It's about walking up to that line and not going over it.
Yeah, I think somebody has to understand the Iranian strategy. As Vali Nasser knows very well, the Iranians are smart, sophisticated, and they have learned history. And history told them that Libya, Syria, and Iraq did it wrong. Pakistan, India, and North Korea did it well. And they have learned the lesson. They are not going to the bomb as fast as possible. They are going to the bomb as safe as possible. And the strategy that we had discovered is sophisticated strategy, is to develop a nuclear program that Zakaria can call a civilian, but it is not a civilian. It's a very redundant, wide, it's covert, and when it's revealed, it's become overt, joining the so-called civilian program. They have developed all the capabilities that will enable them to become nuclear at the time of their decision. So strategically, they decided to go to a nuclear weapon. Otherwise, they will not suffer all the sanctions and all the difficulties that they have now. They want to go to the nuclear weapon at the time of their will, and it will be very difficult to stop them at that time. And Iran basically referred to the Security Council, not by Israel, not by the Zionist movement. It was referred to the Security Council by the UN watchdog in Vienna, the IAEA, because they cheat, because they concealed, because they lied, because they deal with nuclear weaponization, because they found high level of enrichment, because they didn't let the IAEA interview their scientists and head of programs, and any intelligence officer know exactly where they are going. Strategically, they are there. They have to do the last mile. And that's what they intend to do if we let them continue with the program.
Okay. I want to be conscious of our time and the need to get to closing statements so that we can have a final second audience vote before 9 o'clock. So Vali Nasser, I want to give you the last word here before we move on to our closing statements.
Well, there are many strategic reasons why Iran would want nuclear capability, a virtual nuclear program, or an actual bomb. And as I said, it has to do with regime survival and its national interest. But if what you're saying is true, then sanctions and diplomacy will not work. Then we're back to the argument. Do we want to go to war to stop it? Or are we going to agree to that we can handle this through containment and deterrence? Because, you know, you said that aggressive sanctions may work and that, you know, international pressure may work, or maybe diplomacy in the second term may work. But according to you, you know, they've already made the decision that they're going to do this because it goes down to that they don't want to have the fate of Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and that they want to have the security that North Korea and Pakistan feel. And if that's the case, then, you know, the only option on the table is that we either contain them and deter them, or that we go to war with them.
Great. Okay, we're going to bring the podium out so that closing statements can take place. We're going to do the closing statements in the opposite order of the opening statements. So, Fareed Zakaria, that means you're up first.
Thank you. You know, when I was a kid in college, I invited Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's defense secretary, to campus to speak. And there was a huge amount of commotion and many protests against him, all from the left. There were people in an audience this size who started standing up and chanting against him. And what they kept saying, the phrase they kept using one after the other, was deterrence is a lie. Because in those days, it was the left that didn't understand deterrence, because they were emotional and irrational, and they felt, surely there's got to be a better way around this. And it was the wise heads, the sane people on the right, steeped in realism and history and tragedy, who reminded us of the